Welcome everyone. Welcome back to the Summer Institute. I hope you had a nice day off and relaxed a bit and had time to discover and explore Berlin, which directly leads to the topic of my talk, namely information search. And Peter last week already highlighted the importance of information search for human cognition and behavior. And to paraphrase his very nice introduction, so the idea is we are not CPANs, but we are active information foragers. And in fact, if you look around, information search is critical for a number of aspects. So we can think about information search in a kind of more perceptual way. So like visual search, where the visual system guides our eye movements to obtain relevant information from the environment. We can think about it in the context of classification, where we need to learn about features and obtain information to classify objects and things into categories. Medical decision-making is an applied field. It's very important for doctors to conduct medical tests, ask their patients for their symptoms, and obtain information to diagnose them. And then in developmental psychology, information search is also an important topic. So all of you probably know children actively inquire and search the environment for information when learning about words or learning about the social or physical structure of the environment. And last but not least, as scientists, we conduct experiments to obtain information. So we ask questions to Mother Nature to learn about our theories and hypotheses. And what I would like to do today is to do a mix between theory and empirical studies. So I would like to introduce kind of the conceptual and statistical foundations for particular models of the value of information that can be used to build different strategies for information search. And we'll also highlight some relations between different types of models, specifically simple heuristics and more complex statistical Bayesian models. And on the empirical side, I would like to talk about three different paradigms that we have been using to investigate information search, both with adult learners and children. And the first topic will be classification. So how can we obtain information when we need to classify objects or things into categories? The second topic will be sequential search, which is something we have used for or investigated in children and adults with these cute little monsters. And the third topic will be the search for rewards in large state spaces where we are acquiring information to obtain rewards and where the structure of the environment provides traction for generalization and learning. And to start with, I would like you to have a look at those little monsters here. So these are stimuli from a developmental study that we recently conducted and concluded. And as you can see, those monsters are all very nice and cute, which is important if you do studies with children. And they also differ in certain features. So some of them are blue, some of them are green, some of them are square, some of them are round, some have a pattern, some don't, and they also have a bunch of individual features. And the game we're playing with the kids is a variant of the 20 questions game, where the goal is to identify an unknown target object with as few questions as possible. So what happens is in the actual experiment, we have cards where these monsters are printed on, we shuffle them, and then we randomly draw one of the monsters. And now the task they are faced with is to identify this monster by asking yes/no questions. And we give them the choice, or the initial choice, between 4 questions. So they can ask about the color feature, so they could ask, is it green? And I can say yes if that's the case, or no if it's not the case. They could ask about the pattern feature, the shape feature, or they could query an individual monster, like, is it this one or is it this one? And what I would like you to think about, just for a few seconds, is with which question would you start? If one of these monsters has been picked at random, so uniform probability over all monsters, your goal is to ask as few questions as possible to identify that unknown target object, and to each question that you ask, I will respond truthfully. And you can choose between color, pattern, shape, or query an individual feature. Individual monster, sorry. So think about that for a few seconds. Okay, so maybe, don't talk about it now. Keep it in the back of your head. Maybe write it down, because I would be curious to hear your intuitions later on, when I will return to this paradigm. Okay? Good. To start with, I would like to talk a bit about classification learning and information search in the context of categorization and explain some of the kind of conceptual and statistical ideas. So if you look at the psychological literature, categorization is a big topic. It's one of the core capacities for human cognition. And usually what happens, you give people a set of stimuli which differ in various features, and then there's a kind of underlying category function that relates the features to category membership, and the task is to learn these mappings. And this little guy here, it's a biological specimen, we call it plankton. And in the experiments we have been conducted, your task is to categorize that item or different types of these items in species A or species B. And these things vary in two features, two binary features. So we have this kind of claw here, which can take this value or that value. And we have kind of this eye here, which is either yellowish or black. And there's a lot of research and a lot of models which are aiming to understand how people do these kind of categorization decisions. And typically, you're presented with a full stimulus information. So you have information about all the features, and your task is to relate the features to the categories. But what if we do not have all the information available, but need to actively acquire that information? So say you don't know which kind of eye this thing has or which kind of claw this thing has. And how can we essentially build a model that tells us which of these features, which of these queries is more useful to achieve good performance? And the general framework I would like to introduce is kind of based on the core idea that what you have to do is to consider possible outcomes of a query. So the idea is if I ask about the eye, then I can either learn it's yellow or black. If I ask about the claw, these are the two possible answers that I could get. And each of these features occurs with a certain probability that we can derive from frequency information or via Bayes rule or in other ways. And the overall usefulness of a question, so querying the claw, say, is a kind of weighted average of the probability of obtaining a certain feature value and the usefulness of that feature value. So how useful is that feature, say, observing this kind of claw with respect to our goals? And the same we can do here. So these are the two feature values, and the overall usefulness of looking at the eye is the probability of observing a feature value and the usefulness of that. Now, the big question is, how do we define usefulness? So what does that actually mean? And this is just a kind of simple weighted average, a simple expectation that's all straightforward. But where things get more interesting is how do we define the usefulness of an answer? What do we actually mean by that? And if you look at the literature, across different fields, there are a number of ideas about how to quantify the value of information and what makes a piece of information useful. So we can think about eliminating hypotheses. So if we learn something about the world and we can get rid of some of the hypotheses, that is kind of useful to us. So that's, for instance, in philosophy of science, Popper, and in psychology, Ways and Selection Task, and then popular science, things like Sherlock Holmes. Improving accuracy is another idea in the literature. So we want to obtain information to improve our, say, classification accuracy. You can also think about reducing uncertainty, so information or data is useful to the extent that it helps us to reduce uncertainty. And a prominent model is information gain, which comes from statistics and philosophy of science and information science. And we can also think about changing beliefs, so if we obtain information that changes our beliefs about the world, that's also something that is important and useful. And I would like to talk about two models in more detail, namely probability gain, which values questions in accordance with the improvement in classification accuracy, and information gain, which is based on entropy reduction, which is a very important and prominent model across all fields. So the task I will be considering is a simple classification task. So we have this bunch of little plankton specimen here, and imagine a pond of 1 trillion of these things, and we take a large sample from it, a couple thousand, and then we check how many of those are species A and species B, and what are the feature relations, the feature likelihoods. And for instance here, 70% of those things belong to species A and 30% belong to species B. And if it's species A, there's a 3% probability that it has a black eye, 97% that it's yellowish, and we have a 41% probability that it's this type of claw, and a 59% probability that it's this type of claw. And the same on this side for species B. So these are the priors and these are the likelihoods. Now, given that information, we can inverse the inference, so standard Bayesian inference. So we can compute given that I observe a certain feature. So say, take a thing from the pond and I observe that it has this kind of claw. So how likely does it belong to species A versus species B? Or say we observe this kind of black eye, how likely is it that it belongs to species A or species B? So we have these kind of posterior distributions here after asking a question and obtaining an answer. And the general framework is essentially based on a comparison between the prior probabilities and the posterior probabilities. So given that kind of structure and setup, how can we compute something like the value of information, whether it's more useful to look at the eye or the claw? And let's talk about classification accuracy first. So the idea is we can make a comparison between the prior and the posterior. And the prior, we know, okay, 70% of them are species A. So if I pick a random plankton item from the pond, what should I do to achieve high classification accuracy? I should say it's species A. And then on average, I will be correct in 70% of the cases. But now I can also obtain information, so I can look at the claw. And if I decide to look at the claw, there's a 43% probability of observing this feature and 57% of observing this feature. And now we can look at the posteriors and say, okay, if I observe this feature, then I can be pretty sure that it's species A with 95% probability. So that's good. So we have improved our accuracy. But if I observe this type of claw, it's not as good because the posterior is essentially very tiny favoring species A, but it's not of a big difference. So if we observe this one, essentially we would go down in our accuracy. And what we do now is to compute the expected accuracy after observing these features. And if you do the math, so it's something like 0.43 times 0.95 plus 0.57 times 0.51, then on average, the posterior accuracy will also be 70%. So from the perspective of probability gain, which is the difference between this and this feature is not helpful at all. But it's different for this feature. If you do the same computations, you will see that on average, in the expectation posterior, you will be correct in 77% of the cases. So you have an increase of 7 percentage points if you decide to look at that feature. So from the perspective of improving accuracy, looking at the eye is more useful than looking at the claw. Good, now let's look at the second model, information gain, which is rooted in information theory and in particular in Shannon entropy. And I already learned at the poster session that quite a few of you already are familiar with entropy and are doing interesting things with that. So here's just a quick 101 on entropy. So entropy is a measure, or can be considered also a measure of predictability and uncertainty in a probability distribution. It's the expected surprisal of events. So say we have a binary variable like species A versus species B. This is our prior distribution. And now we have something which is called a surprisal or atomic information function. And the original version from Shannon, that's the negative log of the probability of the event. So we take the negative log of 0.3, then we are here, take the negative log of 0.7, then we're here. And the idea behind that is the more unlikely an event is, the more we are surprised observing it. So if you walk on the streets and you find €1, yeah, maybe you might be surprised, but not really. But if you find 100,000 euros, then you're really, really surprised, yeah? And this is kind of what that function does. And the entropy is essentially the kind of weighted average, and then you get this nice kind of curve, which is the entropy function. And information gain values questions in accordance with the expected reduction in entropy. Okay? So now we can do the same for this model. So the structure is exactly the same, but now we talk not about accuracy, but about reducing uncertainty. So what we do is essentially we look at the prior and we see, okay, the information contained in that distribution is 0.88 bits. It just follows from this kind of computation. Now again, we can consider the different queries that we can conduct, look at the eye or look at the claw. What would happen if we observe a certain feature value and can compute the remaining entropy? And then we can form an expectation. And then we have something like the posterior entropy is 0.69 bits. So the information gain is 0.19. And we can do the same here. And what you see here is that from the perspective of information gain, this query is more useful than this because we reduce our uncertainty by 0.19 bits, and here only by 0.1 bits. And this is an important message. So we have all these ideas in the literature, and there's a bunch of models and a large literature on how these models have been used. but they do not necessarily make the same predictions. So in this case, for instance, if you use probability gain, you would say, okay, we should look at this feature because that improves classification accuracy. If you're going with information gain, you should look at this feature to reduce uncertainty. Good, just quickly, so entropy, I mean, the most famous entropy is Shannon entropy, but there's a whole world of different entropy measures. I won't be talking about it in detail. It's a kind of biparametric family of entropy measures, which covers a lot of prominent models as special cases. If you're interested in that, we can talk about it later or this afternoon. Good, now let's have a look at human information search. So here's a classic study from the 80s in a scenario that have been used to show or to investigate how sensitive people are to the value of information. It's called the planet Wuma scenario, and on that planet there live 1 million creatures, 1 million invisible creatures in this case. 70% of them are Bezos and 30% of them are Gloms. And they differ in certain features, so all of them gurgle a lot, but then you have features drink tea and hula hoop, and none of the Bezos drinks tea, but 24% of the Gloms drink tea, and 43% of the Bezos wears a hula hoop, and all of the Gloms wear a hula hoop. And the question that was asked then to participants is, okay, if you can ask a single question and then need to decide whether the alien is a Bezo or a Glom, which question would you ask? So let me pose that question to you.
Whether it drinks tea.
Okay, why?
Because if it does, it's a Glom, and if it doesn't, it's a Bezo.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's...
Oops. Good, but that was a good intuition. Any other opinions?
I can be sure it's a Glom, but it doesn't.
If you ask for drink tea, okay? But that's true also here. Well, not necessarily, well, it depends on whether it wears a hula hoop.
But tea is 100% diagnostic, or so if I know it drinks tea, it must be a Glom.
It's not 100% diagnostic, but I come back to that. Yeah. Good.
I'd say I'd still stick with the tea thing, but because 24 is lower than 43, so the probability that I do get a diagnostic answer is higher.
Good. Then, yeah, we'll explain what the solution is in a moment. Okay, then we can vary this thing, so we can also look at different priors and different probability, like feature likelihood. And if you do the math, I mean, both of the questions are informative, but to a different extent. So in this scenario, this one is the higher probability gain feature, but this one is the higher information gain feature. And conversely, in this scenario, this is the higher information gain feature, and this is the higher probability gain feature. So I won't do the math here, but I mean, we can talk about it later. It's pretty much straightforward. But one thing is that these kind of tasks, they do not always trigger strong intuition. So people have different opinion on what questions would be more useful or less useful. And kind of finding in the literature is that there's no kind of consistency in terms of which model explains human behavior the best. But then what we have done, and a colleague, Jonathan Nelson, has done, is to use a different paradigm, and that relates to the things that Ralf Hertwig already talked about, decisions from experience, namely experience-based learning. So instead of giving people the kind of the numbers that you just saw, we let them learn from experience the relevant probabilities. And it works like this. So we have our nice plankton things, and we have a kind of try-by-try learning phase. And so they see a stimulus, full information on the features, they make a decision whether it's A or B, and they get truthful feedback. And they do that for a long time, so we have a very strict learning criterion, so sometimes they do that for hundreds or thousands of tries until they really, really know the relevant probabilities. And then we ask them, okay, now you can't see both features, and you can choose to see one of them. Which one would you like to see? And then they can choose, look at, say, the eye or the claw, and then make a decision. And what you see here is from a paper from Jonathan Nelson, 2010. You can more or less ignore the conditions. These are just various probability structures. But the key difference I would like to point you to is these two columns. So this is the experience-based task. So if they have learned in a try-by-try fashion, and this is the statistics-based task where they give kind of a verbal description. And the numbers is the percentage of subjects who prefer the higher probability gain feature. And as you can see, there's a massive difference between these two presentation formats. If they have learned from experience, there's a strong preference for the probability gain feature, so for improving accuracy. Whereas if you have this kind of words and numbers task, it's not fully clear what people are doing. So sometimes you see a slight preference for the probability gain feature, but sometimes you also see a preference for other types of models and features. So kind of take-home message of this is it doesn't matter how you convey information. So even if you have a kind of nice formal model, psychologically we have other factors to consider, like the way we present information. Now let's get back to the kind of classic words and numbers task. And so one of the ideas in the literature was, or one of the findings is that people sometimes use a simple heuristic. It's based on the difference in feature likelihoods. So what they do is essentially they look at the feature likelihoods, and maybe some of you did that too, and they check for which feature the difference is higher. So in this case, it's 24 percentage points, and for this feature, it's 57 percentage points. Here it's 22 versus 26. And they take the feature that has a higher difference in likelihoods. But as you can see, such a strategy yields diverging results with respect to the models that we consider. Because if you go with a likelihood difference, you would pick the higher information gain feature here, but you would pick the higher probability gain feature here. So this explains some of the variance and essentially shows how strategies vary as a function of the kind of informational environment. But one thing to note here is that, so in the original papers, that was considered a kind of silly strategy because they had a particular normative model in mind and said, okay, people don't do that, but they take this kind of likelihood difference. That's a bad idea. But in fact, you can show through analytic analyses that this kind of strategy implements particular type of Bayesian models and exactly implements them. So Jonathan showed that if you go with a likelihood difference heuristic, you maximize expected change in beliefs. And you can also show that with uniform price, so if both types of aliens were exactly equally likely, you will also identify the higher probability gain question. And then we did some additional analyses where you have kind of situation-specific payoffs. So you're being rewarded higher for one type of classification decision than for others. And again, you can show that under certain circumstances, that kind of heuristic is actually optimal, provably optimal, as opposed to other models. So the point here is, originally that was considered a kind of silly heuristic, but then if you take a closer look at these kind of models and go through the math and try to relate this heuristic to other models, you see that there are kind of intriguing relations between them, and that in fact, such a simple strategy can implement a kind of more complicated Bayesian model. Good. Now I would like to come back to, sorry, yeah.
What is the optimal solution in the previous text? Right, I'm sorry, maybe you explained it.
You mean here?
No, in the full mark planets. What is the optimal?
Well, I mean, the question is there an optimal solution? It depends on your goal. If your goal is classification accuracy, what people were asked for, and we also did that, so we essentially paid them, showed them something like this and told them, okay, if you look at a feature and correctly decide which category it belongs to, you get €1. If you make a wrong decision, you don't get €1. So that, then in that case, your goal should be, if you want to maximize rewards or earn as many rewards as possible, you should go with probability gain to improve your classification accuracy.
But if you're asking only one question, just a single question, then it's not is it classification still the objective?
It is, because you have a single stimulus. You can decide to look at the eye or the claw, and then afterwards you classify that object and say this belongs to species A or species B. And then if we pay you for correct decisions, what you should do if you want to maximize rewards, to go with probability gain. But it's a good point because it depends on the goals of the agents. I mean, there's not kind of single normative model. You can't necessarily say this is kind of the optimal model or the best model or the normative model. You need to take into account what is actually a goal. If it's not classification accuracy, well, then you shouldn't go with probability gain. If you want to reduce your uncertainty in the sense of Shannon entropy, you would go with information gain.
And can I ask how you use the base rates, the probabilities of each category at all in your?
Well, that's exactly like we do it here. So essentially what you do is you take the base rates and the likelihoods to derive the posteriors. So if that alien drinks tea, then you can derive the posterior probability distribution and compute again the probability gain and information gain. So the logic is always the same. I mean, It's like, okay, you have the prior distribution, and via Bayesian inference you can derive the posterior distribution, and then you can think about what does that mean for my goals and the kind of the amount of information that I've acquired.
Hi, I have a general question, but I could also adapt it a little to be a little bit of a specific follow-up to his question. So the general part is, so with probability gain, it's obviously helpful, as you've said several times, to improve classification accuracy, which is kind of an obvious goal that we often have, and it's easy to think about. But the other information gain is not so clear to me what the specific goal might be. Yes. In everyday terms, and the way to make that a specific follow-up is how would you perhaps incentivize that? Because it could be that they're choosing, they're heavily leaning towards this searching for probability gain because that's exactly what's rational for this task.
Yeah. So let me postpone that question for the next task, because their probability gain is not a good idea, but their information gain is what you actually want to do. Yeah.
Are you trying to model how human beings search for information in classification tasks, or are you trying to build the most efficient system for classification?
So I'm interested in both questions. So I'm interested in the human psychology and how people kind of intuitively value information, how they search for information. But I'm also interested in more theoretical questions like kind of what is the optimal model to a particular solution. And also in the next part with the monsters, I will be talking about optimal solutions and kind of efficiency.
Okay. Another question, sorry, is in the data that you have, do you just have the probability distributions, or do you also have specific images correlating the population sample?
What do you mean with images?
So, like, you have a distribution of like, these creatures, right? Mm-hmm. And some of them tend to be one versus other category, and you have some way of saying which one is which based on some features, right? So in a standard like pattern recognition approach, you would feed a network all of those examples, and then the features would be extracted, and the model would then be built.
Yes. So, I mean, there are different ways of doing it. So what we do here is a kind of try-by-try learning. So you see one item is drawn from the population, you're presented with this, you make a decision, another example is drawn. Then we have done other studies, so Charlie has done some very nice work where we look at different presentation formats. So what if you give the information in terms of natural frequencies or more kind of graphical, visual displays, and then see how that mediates information search. Okay. Okay, so let me go on with the monsters. Okay, so that's that paradigm, so this kind of 20 questions game where one of the items is picked at random and has to be identified with as few yes/no questions as possible, has been widely used in a number of studies, especially in developmental psychology, because it's kind of very nice and intuitive paradigm. You can play it even with younger kids. So there are also commercial versions of this game, the Guess Who game, where it's kind of one player against the other. Which has a kind of also tactical component, but the kind of standard form has been used in a variety of studies. And one kind of classic analysis is to look at the different types of questions that children are asking. And for instance, there are certain developmental trajectories in that younger children. What they often tend to do is they query single monsters. So they ask, is it this monster? No, okay. Is it this monster? No, okay. Is it this monster? No, okay. And eventually you get to the goal. So it just is not a very efficient strategy, but eventually we'll identify the item. And then what happens when children get older, they ask what is called constraint-seeking questions, so they query features that are possessed by multiple objects. So they might first ask about, is it color, or does the monster have a pattern, or things like that. And more recently, information theoretic models have been applied to these kinds of tasks, especially information gain, which has the advantage that you can also kind of quantify questions' usefulness and get a more fine-grained picture of developmental trajectories and how sensitive children are to varying structures and in their information search. Good, so maybe we can do a quick poll, because I would be curious to hear about your intuitions. So we finalized the study. I'm almost done with writing up the paper. So in this kind of task, So what would be the first question that you would ask if your goal is to ask as few questions as possible? So who thinks that the color feature is the best first question? Good, quite a few people. How about the pattern feature? Okay. Single person. The shape feature? Okay, quite a few. Does anyone like to start with asking about an individual monster? Yay, good. Okay. Let me see. So one strategy that has been observed is what we call the split half heuristic. So what adults and if children get older also do is they query a feature that is possessed by closest to half of the items. So ideally you would have a feature that splits exactly half the hypothesis space, which in this case is not possible because the best split you can achieve is 3 versus 9. But that's better than, say, the pattern feature, which has a split of 2 against 10, and the individual monster has 1 against 11. And so here we have a kind of established behavioral heuristic. And now one question we're interested in, how does that actually relate to these kind of more complex Bayesian information theoretic models? And the models that I've just discussed, stepwise information gain, or information gain, probability gain, they're called stepwise optimal methods. Because what they do, they essentially look one step ahead into the future. So they consider, if I ask that question and I observe this feature or that feature, what are the implications? What does that mean for my task or my goals? And I would like to briefly discuss 3 questions. So the first one is the relationship between the split half heuristic and these kind of stepwise optimal models. Then, relating to the question we just had, are stepwise optimal models in fact globally optimal? So do they identify the most efficient sequence of queries? And then on the empirical side, how do children and adults search for information when you need to plan ahead to identify the best first query? So let's start with the first question, the relationship between the split half heuristic. So you can show, I mean, in this kind of task, you can also apply information theoretic models like information gain, and you can see that essentially different questions reduce uncertainty to a more or lesser extent. And what you see here is the entropy function that you saw already earlier. On the x-axis, we have the proportion of items possessing the feature, and here we have the information gain. So how much information do we gain by asking that question? And you can see the maximum is at 0.5, so if we exactly split half, we have the maximum of information or the maximum maximum expected reduction entropy, and that decreases monotonically in both directions from that maximum. And you can see here, 3 to 9 split has this kind of information gain, 2, 10, and this. And you see kind of the rank ordering of the splits corresponds exactly to the rank ordering of the amount of uncertainty reduction. So what you can do essentially, if you use that heuristic, you can maximize a reduction in entropy in a kind of stepwise optimal fashion without computing the kind of weighted average of logarithms, etc. So there's a kind of formal basis for this kind of behavioral heuristic. And one explanation would be people use it because it actually corresponds to one of the important measures in philosophy of science on the value of information. Good, now let's think about, okay, but is that kind of strategy actually optimal? And remember, the goal of the game is not to ask informative questions. I mean, to some extent, that's the means to an end, because what you actually want to do is you want to identify the true item with as few questions as possible. And from a formal perspective, that corresponds to identifying the most efficient question tree, binary question tree, with the shortest expected path lengths. So this is a question tree. What such a tree essentially tells you is which is the question I should start with. Given I obtain a yes or a no answer, what should be the next question that I should ask until I essentially reach the hypothesis, so there's only one item remaining, and then I know what's the true target item. And this kind of seemingly simple problem is in fact intractable. So what I plot here is, so these are the number of queries that are available, and these are the number of full trees that you can construct from these. And you can see that blows up very quickly, so essentially it grows super exponentially. So exhaustive search is simply not feasible. So it's a very simple problem, but it's like chess or some other things. Once you want to consider all possible solutions, it just doesn't work. So from a kind of computational standpoint, you need some kind of heuristic. So it could be heuristic in the computer science sense or heuristic in a psychological sense. And for smaller number of queries, you can actually identify the globally optimal solution, so the tree with a maximum expected path length reduction, but that doesn't work in general. So here we have a kind of simple problem, but in fact it's completely intractable. And there's a kind of analytic proof for that, and I can also show you how it works essentially in a more kind of intuitive way, but I think the bottom line is clear. The problem is essentially too complex. Now, what we did here now, and this now relates to your intuitions, what you see here is again the 12 stimuli. We have the possible questions that you could ask. This is the split, and the information gain is a kind of monotonic function of that. And this is the path length. So the path length is the expected number of questions which you need when starting with that question and deciding optimally thereafter. And lower is better, so you want to ask as few questions as possible. So if you look at the numbers, you can see that this does not correspond to the split or information gain at all. In fact, so in the more kind of, or the most interesting point questions are these ones. So both induce the same split, 3 to 9. They have the same stepwise information gain, but they differ a lot with respect to the actual objective function, the number of questions that you need. So if you start with a shape feature, you will on average need 5.0383 questions. But if you start with a color feature, you will need fewer questions, 4.58. And to give you an intuition why that's the case, and that's where the planning component comes into play. So say you start with the shape feature. So you ask, is it square? And there are two possibilities. Either the answer is yes, in which case only 3 monsters remain. That's good because you're very close to the solution. On average, you will need 5/3 questions to identify the true item. But in the other case, which is more likely, still 9 items are remaining. And in this case, there's no feature which provides a better split than 1 to 8. Okay? Which means essentially it's a kind of one-way street. If you end up here, you can only ask rather low information value questions. But if you start with the color question, that's why this question is more useful. So if you ask, say, is it green? If it's yes, again, we have 3 monsters, that's fine, that's the same. But the more likely outcome is that you learn that it's blue. But in this case, you can still ask about the pattern feature, which gives you a 2 to 7 split. And consequently, what happens then is that it's better to start with the color feature than the shape feature, because you can ask better questions afterwards. So that's kind of the rationale behind it. Now, we were interested in what people, how they search for information in such a task where you essentially need to look ahead to identify the most efficient query. And we have the monster. These are the stimuli that we actually used. And for the kids, we also had a kind of magic machine. So you put a monster inside, you find the right monster, then it makes sounds and light, and everything is very exciting. And we have costly search. So we gave them 10, 50 euro cents coins initially, so 5 euros in total. And for each question that they asked, they had to pay 50 cents, which for the children is not always so easy to give back the money that they just obtained. And so we had 2 experiments, different age groups. So this one I will only talk about the older children, adult searches, because the results are pretty much the same. Okay, let me give you a quick look at the results. So we did various analyses, but the simplest one and the key analysis is this one. So what you see here is efficiency. So that's the number of questions that children and adults needed. So children are orange and adults purple. And you can, this is the mean and the bar is the median. And one thing that you can observe is that children are essentially as efficient as adults. So they don't, I mean, this particular study, they need even a fewer questions than adults, but in general, there's no difference between adults and children. So that's fine, but then the key question we were interested in was which was the first question that they picked. And our idea was, okay, if they tie in their split, so both induce a 3 to 9 split, then what could break this tie? Because the split half heuristic doesn't really help you here. So you see 2 questions, you think, okay, both induce the same split. But maybe you could look 1 step ahead and then consider what happens on the next step. So our hypothesis was that adults would be sensitive to that and children maybe as well. And what you see here, the proportion of subjects choosing one of the questions. So this is the color question, yeah, the most efficient one, and this is the shape question. I mean, that was all counterbalanced in the experiment, but for this particular set, these are the questions. This is the most efficient one, this is the least efficient one. And as you can see, there's a strong tendency to choose a question that induces a 3 to 9 split, so which has the highest stepwise information gain, but we see essentially no sensitivity or no difference between those two questions. So, although this one is much less efficient than this one, essentially people, I mean both children and adults seem to go with, or seem to be indifferent between those two questions. Good, so we conducted more experiments, but the finding is pretty stable, so I've been fiddling with that for years, and it's really, really difficult to get people to think ahead in this kind of paradigm. That's why I was also interested in your opinion, because most people have the strong intuition about the split, but that kind of overrides pretty much everything. And maybe you can pay people $1,000, maybe then they are fine with essentially thinking things through, but it's not really intuitive. So we have kind of good news and bad news. So on the one hand, we can show that children search as efficiently as adults in these kinds of tasks, at least from a certain age on. It gets a little bit worse when they are younger, of course. But they also search as myopically as adults. So both children and adults do not really plan ahead. And they seem to be primarily relying on heuristics, stepwise optimal methods. So the split half heuristic, which implements stepwise information gain. Now you could say, okay, people are a bit stupid. Why are they doing that? It's just planning one step ahead. Okay. So what we did is essentially is to run computer simulations to see how much loss is actually incurred if you use that strategy. Because in many, many of these environments, the split halfiness of a query will correspond also to their efficiency. And what we did here is we vary column-wise the number of features. So in the monsters, those were 12 items, but we also have 15 and 18 items. Then we vary the feature density, so the average number of items possessing that feature, and the number of questions. And you can see, I hope you can see it, that so green essentially means the split half heuristic identifies the most efficient query, and reddish means it's kind of the proportion of times it identifies the optimal query. And you can see the more complex the whole thing gets, you have more items, more questions, the less likely the split half heuristic will pick up the optimal question. But that's just the proportion of times you select the optimal query. But you can also look at a more kind of fine-grained measure, namely the actual costs that are incurred by selecting a suboptimal query. And then you see, well, qualitatively, it's something like the pattern is the same as things get more, the performance drops as things get more complicated, but you also see, if you look at the scale, the actual loss in the number of questions that you need is not really big. And so we have done a bit more extensive simulation. You can show, okay, the more complex things get, the more losses incurred, and there are certain limits because, as I said, the problem is intractable, so you can't do arbitrary large sets. But still you might argue, okay, they use this strategy essentially because it's very easy to apply and incurs not a big loss in terms of number of questions needed. Good. Questions so far? Okay, then I would like to look at a third paradigm, and this is about search in vast spaces, essentially situations in which you cannot explore all options, but you want to gain rewards, and you can learn about the structure of the environment, which can guide your search behavior. And before showing the details, I should say, so this is work with two brilliant researchers. So you already know this guy, Charlie, who's very good at organizing summer institutes, but also extremely good at doing research. And this is Eric, who sits somewhere in the back, I think. And those two guys have really pushed this line of research forward. So if you like it, the credit goes to them. If you don't like it, you can. Okay, so kind of the general problem we're interested in are kind of three things. So one is generalization. So how do people learn to generalize? How do they learn about the structure of the environment, and how does that mediate their behavior? And the kind of exploration-exploitation trade-off that Peter already talked about last week. So the problem is, if we cannot explore all options, we often are faced with this kind of explore-exploit trade-off. So do we explore new options, maybe to find higher rewards, or do we exploit known options? And empirically, we're interested in how the children and adults generalize and learn. And this is kind of the classic picture for illustrating the explore-exploit trade-off, but I saw actually the real thing just 2 days ago at my niece's birthday. So they were playing this game, and I mean, they were really keen on exploiting that thing and hitting it. Good, so the empirical paradigm we're using is what's called a spatially correlated multi-arm banded task. So what you see here is an 11 by 11 grid, and behind each grid is a reward hidden. And initially, one of these is revealed, so say you get 39 points, and we incentivize search. The more points you get, the more money you make. And the tricky part is you only have a limited number of actions available. So we have essentially a multi-arm bandit with 121 arms, 11 by 11, but we only give people, say, 20 clicks or 40 clicks. So the search horizon is fairly limited. And within that limited amount of number of clicks, your goal is to obtain as many rewards as possible. And if those were kind of independent arms of a bandit, there wouldn't be much you can, I mean, there's something you can do, but it's a pretty complex task. But learning about, say, this item here doesn't tell you about anything of the other ones. But what we have here is that there's a certain environmental structure behind it, in the sense that rewards are spatially correlated. So low rewards go with low rewards and high rewards with high rewards. And that provides traction for generalization and guiding search. So essentially, that's kind of screenshot from the experiment. People see one thing revealed, they can click another one, they get points, then they can decide, do I want to click the same again or look somewhere else in the space, and so on. And then do that until the search horizon is exhausted. And the nice thing here is you can manipulate kind of the environmental structure and see how that mediates people's behavior. So what we have done, for instance, in a set of studies is to contrast smooth environments where you have large degrees of spatial correlation. So you see, okay, here neighboring fields are highly correlated in their rewards. So dark red is higher rewards, light red or yellowish is not so high rewards. Here it's pretty smooth, the landscape, whereas here it's a more rough environment. It's still a bit correlated, but the correlation is not as strong as in this case. And what we, Charlie and Eric have also done is to look at natural environments, because to some extent that corresponds to distribution of resources in actual natural ecologies. So kind of what we had there were natural environments, so crop data and yield data, and then essentially the advantages that comes already in this kind of format, because you have these massive areas which are partialized into these little bits, and then you can let people search in these kinds of environments. And how can you approach that problem? So, I mean, it's again a very intuitive task, I think, but there's a lot of interesting modeling that you can do to understand how people learn in these kinds of situations. And we have looked at a whole bunch of models. I will only talk about one of them to give you kind of the flavor and the general ideas. So the starting point is a set of observations. So at each time step, you get more information about the rewards and the location of the rewards. And now what we can build is a learning model. So this particular model is based on Gaussian processes, so kind of fancy Bayesian regression approach from machine learning where it's widely used. And what the model does is essentially it generalizes about the structure of the environment. So here are the predictions of the model. Essentially, this is the color encodes the mean expected reward. And what that model allows you to do is essentially to predict the rewards that you might obtain for unseen options. So you're generalizing to novel options beyond the experience that you have done. And you can also, or what you get from the model is an estimate of the uncertainty. So in this case, the variance or standard deviation, you name it. So it's essentially a normal distribution which has a certain mean and a certain variance. And one important parameter in the model is the lambda parameter, which essentially governs the amount of correlation that the model assumes. So if you have a high lambda, then the assumption is that the environment is more smooth. So what you see is the distance between tiles in the grid and kind of the mean Pearson correlation. And as lambda gets lower, essentially that correlation drops off more quickly. So this is a learning model, so you learn about the structure of the environment, but now you need another component, which is a search strategy. So given that information, how do I actually use that for deciding where to click next? And again, we have looked at various things. So one of the things we have looked here, which is theoretically important for the next step, is called upper confidence bound sampling. So what that model does is essentially to combine the expected reward and the associated uncertainty. So this is the simple one-dimensional case, and you have the means here, the black line, and the observations, so estimated means, and you have the uncertainty associated with it. And what the model does is essentially it has what is called an exploration bonus. So say if you have two tiles and both are assumed to have, I don't know, 50 points rewards, but one has a higher variance, you would kind of optimistically inflate that prediction and go for that one. So you're kind of assuming, it's highly uncertain, but I integrate that with a mean expected reward to say this is a good search option. And so this is the beta parameter, which kind of represents the amount of directed exploration. How much do you value uncertainty? And given these kind of decision utilities or sampling utilities, we have a decision rule which transforms those into choice probabilities. So it's a probabilistic model. The model doesn't say person X will do that, but essentially we have a probability distribution over all possible options. And what we use is kind of standard softmax choice rule, which has a one free parameter, the temperature parameter. And that is a pretty flexible choice rule depending on how you set the parameter. You can either always go, so if you have a high, so low temperature parameter, you're kind of approximating an argmax response rule, so choosing always the best option. And if tau is higher, then the things get more noisy and more evenly distributed across all possible times. Good, so we've done various studies with that. Talk to me or Charlie or Eric. And also one of you, Nicholas, is also working with a related paradigm. He also has done very interesting stuff. What I would like to do now in the last few minutes is to look at a developmental study that we have done. And that's, from our perspective, interesting. I mean, my background is cognitive psychology. Now I'm kind of developmental psychology, and I like to combine those things. And one key finding, I mean, not only in the literature, but pretty much from everyday experience, is that children ask a lot of questions, have strong exploratory behavior. That's kind of a characteristic feature of children. And now there are different accounts how to explain that. So why is there this kind of curiosity drive? Why are they so eagerly exploring options? And I mean, broadly speaking, yes, because they need to learn about the world. But what's kind of the mechanism behind that? And one idea is that children's behavior is simply more random. Because, for instance, due to cognitive limitations, and their memory is not as well developed as adult memory, etc. And you have essentially kind of a noisy decision maker who tries out a lot of options to learn about the world. And then if they get older, that kind of cools down, cools off, and they become more consistent. Another suggestion is that they are kind of curiosity driven in the sense that they eagerly want to explore uncertain options. So here it's a more goal directed behavior. So the random component also would lead to more exploration, but here it's not random or less random behavior. It's more kind of, you really look at the most uncertain options and choose that. And then another hypothesis is that their capacity to generalize is less pronounced than adults. So integrating all that information learning, say, about environmental structure is something that they do to a lesser extent than adults. And what we did now in this study, and that's why I discussed the model before, is that we have essentially parameter estimates that correspond to these kind of mechanisms. So on the one hand, for the generalization part, we have this lambda parameter, which tells us, okay, how much do they generalize based on their experience about the structure of the environment. For the goal-directed exploration, we have the beta parameter, which tells us something about how much do they value uncertainty relative to exploiting rewards. So that kind of represents the goal-directed behavior. And then we have the temperature parameter in the softmax choice rule, which corresponds more to the kind of noisy and random search behavior. Okay?
These questions situations where options are... These questions seem to only pertain to situations where the options are known, and of course, much exploration, particularly in children, I might say, takes place to find options. So the options aren't known. Is that a whole different line of research, or otherwise, how does that tie into your questions?
So what would be an example for finding options? I mean, you're right, the options here are essentially known. I mean, it's kind of relatively restricted set. I mean, compared to classic two-armed bandits, it's very complex. Compared to the real world, it's of course overly simplistic. But you're right, you know the options that you can take, but what you don't know are the outcomes associated with these options.
Yeah, but I'm talking about if you move outside of a simple laboratory setup and into a real world discussion.
Yeah, I think that's beyond the scope of this model, because essentially the option space is more or less fixed. I mean, probably you can amend the model and integrate that in the model too, but here it's a fixed set of options, and you learn about the outcomes of these options, but not about which options to take in the first place.
Yeah, so somewhat correlated question. Here you're in it's a two-dimensional projection of a three-dimensional space. Do you have any intuition on what happens if people have to search in like an n larger than something space? Do they have like heuristics, they reduce it back to a two-dimensional projection or something like that, or something else?
Good point.
Thanks.
Empirically, it's kind of on our to-do list. So for the model, it's not a big problem. I mean, this is kind of a simple case where you just have the x and y coordinates are the input to the model. But the model in principle can handle kind of arbitrary number of options or dimensions. What humans do is a different question. I mean, we started off with this paradigm also, especially with the children. It's very intuitive, and it relates to a lot of research that's done in other areas, say machine learning, kind of multi-armed bandit problem, and decisions from experience, what Ralph and colleagues are doing. Excuse me. But you're right, of course. I mean, it could be much more complex, and not sure what's been going on then there on the psychology side. So on the modeling side, I think it's well defined and capable of handling much more complex problems. But then I assume at some point there's a kind of breaking point where the model might not explain people's behavior as well.
So is there a reason why you are using upper confidence bound and not lower confidence bound? The second question is there a relation that can be made between upper confidence bound and individual measures of risk assessment?
Good question. So first one, why UCB? I mean, partly because it's kind of a well-established algorithm in the machine learning literature, and there are certain performance guarantees. Yeah, but we've also looked at other types of models. The second point is a good one. I haven't really thought about that. So, because as I said, I mean, you can consider as a kind of optimistic sampling strategy, but you could also say, well, maybe you take a pessimistic sampling strategy. And I know, Charlie, I mean, you did stuff on safe bets. Is that?
Yeah, with Eric. And
in
that case, upper confidence band is not the better strategy to use. We see something else where it's like we have a strategy called probability being safe. So the probability being under this threshold where if the sample or reward below that, the round ends. So this is task specific, and here we only have rewards, and we don't have any losses. So there's only gains here.
Oh yeah, okay, that's another important difference, yeah. But I mean, generally, I think my approach to this is that we have a kind of toolbox of building blocks that we can use to build different kinds of models, and I think it's very important to explore different kinds of models and how they behave and test them competitively against each other. And yeah, because sometimes these choices are more or less arbitrary, why this model or that model, and you can inform them theoretically, but maybe that's not always the case. So I think it's valuable to look at different kinds of models. And I mean, as Charlie just said, so if you have losses, maybe then it's better to have a different strategy than this one where you only have gains and no losses. Okay, then just continue. Good, so this is what we saw already before. And then the point was we have these kind of three parameters that correspond to these three mechanisms that are discussed in the literature. And the experiment we did, so this kind of schematic representation, So essentially what children do, so that was tablet-based, so and we go to museums where we test them, essentially, if they walk around and ask them, do you want to play a game? And then they do several rounds, so there's a practice round, so to illustrate the mechanics of the task, and then they do a number of grid worlds. In each grid they can choose options, and we manipulate various things like horizon and environmental structure. So we have the smooth and the rough environments to see how that mediates behavior and how that affects parameter estimates. And okay, so this is the sample. We had 55 younger children, mean age around 77.5, then a bunch of 10-year-olds and also adult subjects. And yeah, as I said, the kind of nice point was to have this kind of combined model which allows us to assess the relative contributions of the different mechanisms. So let's look at some of the data. I won't present all of it, but you can ask Charlie or Eric or me for a draft of the paper. So what's plotted here is the performance, so the obtained rewards, and we have this 3 color coding scheme. So from left to right, it's the age group. So these are the youngest children, these are the slightly older children, these are the adults. And these 3 things are the behavior in the rough environments, so where the spatial correlation is not as strong as in the smooth environments, which you see here. And you can see 2 points here. So if you contrast behavior within age groups, you can see that they are always doing better in the smooth than in the rough environments. So that holds for all of the 3 groups. So essentially, already even the youngest children, 7 to 8-year-olds, kind of learn about the environmental structure and are able to exploit that structure in their search behavior. Otherwise, we wouldn't see a difference. And the other thing is that generally then we have an overall trend of age. So adults are doing better than older children, and which in turn are doing better than younger children. And what you see on the right here are the learning curves. So we can also look at within one try, within one grid, how performance improves. So on the x-axis you have the trials, so here we have 25 clicks, I guess, and the kind amount of rewards obtained on average on these trials. And as you can see, performance improves, and the solid lines are the smooth environment, the dotted lines are the rough environments. So we again see the contrast between smooth and rough environments and how that mediates behavior. And we also see the age-related trends, so that adults are better than children.
Do they know the range of the maximum?
Sorry?
Do they know the range of the maximum?
Of the maximum reward? No, we scale that each round. So it's always in a certain range, but we want to avoid that they know essentially, here's the 100. And then, of course, they would only exploit. So you need to learn in each round, again, what is kind of the maximum reward that I can obtain. Okay, then let's have a look at the parameter estimates, which in these studies were kind of one of the key interests. So again, we have the age groups here, and here we have the 3 columns are the different parameters. So this is the generalization parameter. So the higher that is, the more people generalize. And as you can see, adults generalize more than children. And again, we see this kind of rough trend here that it increases with age. So children generalize less than adults. Then we also have the exploration parameter beta. And here you see the opposite relation. You can see that children explore more eagerly than adults. So they seek out the uncertain options more strongly than adults. So that kind of represents how they value uncertainty. And another key finding is that there's essentially no difference in terms of random exploration, which is important because that's kind of the overall basic, I mean, to some extent, Strawman hypothesis, but it's not just random or noisy behavior, but there is systematicity in the behavior. And the thing is, from the behavior alone, that's very difficult to tease apart. So that's why we have essentially the kind of computational modeling approach that allows us to assess the relative contributions of these mechanisms. And what you see here are the simulated learning curves. So essentially, we take the parameter estimates, I think the median parameter estimates in this case, and then we model the behavior. So if you have these kind of parameter estimates, how would the model behave? You see then that you get very similar learning curves to the actual learning curve. So these are the simulated ones, and these are the actual ones. Good. That's almost my last slide. So wrap up. So I hope I've conveyed that information search is a very critical component of cognition and behavior. And I think it's actually a much under-researched topic. So I think there are hundreds and thousands of studies where full information is available, but there are much fewer studies where you actively need to search for information before making a decision. And I think a kind of comprehensive account of human cognition must not only explain how we update beliefs, so things like Bayes' rule, how we integrate new information, our knowledge base, but also how we actively seek out that information, how we do that. Then in the literature, and that literature really spans across psychology, statistics, philosophy of science, machine learning, there's a bunch of different ideas of what makes a question useful, and I think they can also guide empirical studies. So I like to have a kind of formal analysis and formal models, and then design experiments to test these models. And there's some very neat relationships between simple heuristics and these more complex Bayesian models. So typically they are seen kind of in conflict with each other, but in these cases you can see like the split half heuristic. So you have a very simple behavioral heuristic, which has been around for, I don't know, 40, 50 years. And now if you do a formal analysis, you can see that it exactly implements kind of a state-of-the-art machine learning algorithm like stepwise reduction of entropy. And last but not least, we have search strategies as a window into human development. That's obviously a question I'm very much interested in. So how do search trajectories develop with age? What distinguishes children from adults? And what can we learn about human cognition by comparing children and adults? Last but not least, of course, these were not all my ideas. And I mean, there's a bunch of people I'm collaborating with, all of them great people, great researchers. You might know some of them, so I just leave it here. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.